Get that mic in your face and start talking, start learning. And, most podcasters throw away the first episode anyway, so don't sweat it. Just get out there and do it.
You're listening to Elevate, the official podcast of elite agent for real estate industry, sales professionals, property managers, and leaders. We bring you the best minds in business and real estate to help you list more, sell more, and elevate your results. To download your written action guide from this podcast containing extra tips, links, and shortcuts, visit eliteagentelevate.com. Now, here is your host, Samantha McLean.
Welcome to another episode of the Elevate podcast, where we delve into some of the most interesting minds in business and in real estate for the very best tips and strategies for you to implement to elevate your business. I'm Samantha McLean, editor of Elite Agent and host of this week's show. Today, my guest is US-based podcast editor and editor, in fact, for all of our podcasts on the Elevate show. So welcome to the show, Carey Green.
Thank you so much, Sam. It's great to be with you.
How many times have you heard me say that?
Oh my gosh, thousands. It feels like thousands anyway.
And did you ever think I'd be saying Carey Green after Welcome To?
No, not at all. But I'm so grateful for the opportunity.
Look, it's lovely to have you here. You edit for a bunch of other people, including a lot of real estate agents.
Yes.
So let's just get a little bit of background on you, Carey. You founded podcast Fast Track back in 2013, which is probably right at the beginning of the podcast, let's call it the podcast wave. So what got you interested in podcasting in the first place?
Well, what got me interested was I was listening to a few podcasts at that time and started one of my own. And so I had been kind of experiencing the pain points of every podcaster, which was the editing and the writing of show notes and all those kinds of things. And at the same time was loving what I was getting out of the podcasts that I was listening to. And so I was working with a friend one day, just trying to help him with some audio issues that I had been able to work on for my show. And he just said right out of the blue, you should start a business doing this. And it was like a great big light bulb that went on for me. And so I started serving him first of all, and then some others. And within 4 to 6 months had my first 10 or 12 clients and had to bring my oldest son on as one of my editors to help. And it just took off from there.
I've said to these guys, look, if you've got a microphone and a website and a desire to add value to people, anyone these days can be a podcaster. So can you talk to me about some of the people that have come to you with podcasts? Like, they're not all Joe Rogans, right?
No, not at all. We serve primarily everyday people who have either a skill or an area of expertise and knowledge that they want to build a platform around in order to benefit an audience. And really, you've hit the nail right on the head. It is an issue of adding value. At least at first, it's less about making a name for yourself and less about making a profit and more about building a platform where you can serve people. And it's out of that service that incredible things happen. I've got stories I could tell you that are just amazing.
That would be great, actually. Give us one of the stories of someone that's come to you and started with no podcast and now is doing amazing things with it.
Absolutely. Well, we have a client who's very atypical for our client base. Most of our clients are solopreneurs or entrepreneurs or real estate agents or financial planners, someone in the business world. This particular client was a fine artist. She had worked for Pixar for a while. She had been a very successful professional artist, just doing her own landscape type paintings and things like that. And she wanted to start a podcast so that she could build relationships with other fine artists that she looked up to. And so she began doing interviews with these people, and one led to another, and one of them would introduce her to someone else. And she has built this very significant platform that has a significant amount of income coming in now, simply because she's been real savvy in how she's gone about courting sponsors for her show who are an exact fit for her audience and those kinds of things. So she serves the fine artist community, and they are just rabid about her podcast. They just love everything that she does because they get down talking about the kinds of brushes they use and the kind of paint they use and what their studio time is like and all kinds of things that to the average listener would be kind of a yawn fest. But for them, it's just great. It's exactly what they love.
If I could just summarize that for our listeners, it's really about having a niche. So it doesn't always have to be all about real estate. But if you could be mad about the community, like what's happening in the community, what new businesses have opened up in the community, like really be that reporter on everything going on in your community. If you're a real estate agent, you will get people listening in, particularly if you market it correctly.
I totally agree with that. I think real estate agents have a unique opportunity for that kind of a niche because they're community-based to begin with. They know their community, or at least should know their community much better than anybody else in the area as far as the neighborhoods and the events going on and all those kinds of things. And if they set themselves up as the one who's always in the know and the one who can provide that information in an entertaining and informative way, I believe they have an opportunity to elevate their brand and their position in the community to a point that they become the go-to person.
There's that word again, elevate. We love that word.
Yeah, that's a great word.
Might name a podcast after it.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
So you've got some clients who are realtors in the US. So talk to me about what sort of things they do with their podcasts.
The one that comes to mind the most obviously for me relating to what we're talking about is a guy who is from Madison, Wisconsin, and he started a show called I Love Madison. And they would do interviews with restaurant owners, with people opening new businesses, with all kinds of people involved in community events, even some government officials, and would even put contests and things like that together where they could put bumper stickers on cars with a certain logo. And if someone took a picture of it and hashtagged it on social media, they were entered into a drawing and all kinds of things like that. So it's been a great platform for him to enable himself to rise up among all the realtors in Madison, Wisconsin as a go-to name, someone that people recognize just by his name and the I Love Madison show.
As I said in the beginning of this, once you've got a podcast recorded, then the opportunities for repurposing that podcast in so many ways are all there for you. What are some of the cleverest ways you've seen people market their podcast out in the wild, let's say?
I think the cleverest that I have seen, which is really a no-brainer once you hear about it, is what I would refer to as an episode swap. It's where you build a relationship with someone else who has a podcast very similar to yours in the sense of it serves the same demographic and the same type of audience, yet it may not be the exact same topics as yours. And so you kind of come to an agreement where they're going to give you their best episode, you're going to give them yours, and then they will record an intro for their audience introducing your podcast. You'll do the same for their podcast. And then you publish those episodes in each other's podcast feeds, just kind of as a you scratch my back, I scratch yours sort of a favor. And you instantly are exposing this other podcaster to a brand new audience who many times are, because they're already podcast listeners, they'll go right over and subscribe if they like the content. And it's really a great option for getting the word out to the exact people you want to hear about what you've got to say.
We actually did that this year for the first time. We did a podcast with some of our listeners will be familiar with Tyrone Shum, who's actually a real estate agent and runs a very successful podcast called Property Investory. And on our podcast, he talked about what investors really want because he interviews investors all the time. So we figured let's get him on our podcast and get him to talk about what our listeners' clients want. And then he got us on his podcast to talk about our investment strategy in commercial real estate because it was a little bit different to the usual residential stuff. And yeah, I would say once he shared his episode and we shared our episode, we ended up with a whole lot more listeners. Again, like you definitely do get a bump out of that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And what you're describing is like guesting on each other's shows. What I'm describing is giving them an episode that's already published. Okay. And then they publish it in their podcast feed kind of as a sample of what your show is like. And the same thing you do for them. And it's totally different content, but it's to the same kind of audience. And it really is amazing. It's kind of like getting samples at the store when you're buying food or things, it gives you a taste of what the show's about and people go in droves to subscribe.
Let's talk about what's going on right now because social distancing is everywhere. It's not just here in Australia. It's a global thing.
Yeah.
Do you feel like this is another way that podcasts are just going to increase in growth?
I do. And what's interesting about that is it hasn't happened immediately. Actually, the stats are showing that out of all the podcast industry wide, listenership has dropped about 18% once the social distancing went into effect. But what I think that comes from is people being out of their normal routine. They normally would listen on a commuter train, or they normally would listen while they're working out in the gym. But now they're out of that routine and they're having to establish a new routine. And I think once they get that new routine in place, the podcasts that matter to them are going to go right back on their schedule and they're going to start listening again. And we're already seeing the numbers start to tick up. So I think not only is it going to get back to where it was, but it's going to grow even further because people are at home looking for things to do, looking for things to listen to and be interested in. And podcasting is a great alternative for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So exactly how difficult is it to get a podcast up and running and off the ground?
Boy, that's a broad question. I think it's going to depend on your tech savviness in one regard, because you have to know how to plug in a microphone and turn on software and hit the record button. I mean, how hard does that sound? It's really not that hard. I think most people struggle with the content more than they do the actual tech side of it. And I've got an exercise I call the 10-10-10 exercise, which is 3 10-minute segments where a podcaster can spend 10 minutes just kind of brain dumping onto a page all the topics they could speak about in an entertaining and informative manner, then spend 10 more minutes organizing and prioritizing those topics in a sequence that makes sense, and then spend 10 more minutes writing out 3 bullet points under each one, starting at the top of the list. And by the end of 30 minutes, you have 10 to 15 to 20 different podcast episodes that you could record just by yourself. And if you have any guests that you think could speak to any of those topics better than you could, there's an opportunity to invite a guest on. And so it really is that simple. And I think especially real estate agents who have expertise in a specific area of the community or a specific part of the industry, they have so much knowledge in their head already. It would not be hard for them to fill up that list.
Yeah, there's a few good strategies you can use, and that is if someone has asked you a question more than once, then that could be a good topic. If you get emails in the door with people asking you questions, that could be a good topic. If it's a question that you've needed to answer, and boy, have there been a lot of questions since social distancing came about, you know, things like, what if I want to sell my home? What if I want to move? Like, everybody wants answers to those questions. So really it's any question, I think, that you guys get asked on a day-to-day basis. But at the beginning of this, like, we decided our podcast would be about half an hour in length with an intro and an outro. What do you think is the ideal length for a podcast these days? Are we better to go short or long?
You know, it kind of depends on the topic, but I think the average across the industry is between 30 and 45 minutes. And if you think about it, for most commutes, that's probably about the same amount of time. So that makes sense. Or the average workout is probably right around that amount of time. So I think it's a good thing to shoot for that. However, we are seeing a lot of advances in what I would call micro content, which is shorter episodes, 10 minutes, even 5 minutes, that are done on a specific topic and in kind of an inspirational, motivational kind of a format, where it's like getting your mind right for the day or getting you on track for the things you have on your agenda. Those kinds of podcasts are really raising in prominence. And I think it's because of Spotify, because Spotify now has this feature called the Daily Drive, and they tend to feature shorter things, and some of those are shorter podcast episodes. And so I think it's just coming on people's radar more easily because of that.
Yeah, I've noticed that actually in my own Spotify. I was looking at my own Daily Drive the other day, and it has 5 or 6 songs and then a podcast or a news brief, and then another few songs and then a podcast or a news brief, and then another 6 songs. So I guess that's the other advantage to podcasting, is it's not just available on your website and your social media, but it does get syndicated out to places like iTunes and Stitcher and Spotify, which could bring you an entirely new audience.
Absolutely. And you were talking earlier about repurposing your podcast audio. Just imagine if you had someone go through one of your normal episodes and take out 3 or 4 5-minute little pieces and submit them in a different podcast feed for Spotify to notice for things like that Daily Drive. You could expand your audience by reaching out through that kind of an algorithm and seeing more people find your show.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, you've just given me an idea.
Write that one down.
I'm going to write that one down. Yeah, we use a tool called repurpose.io. That'll end up being in the notes, I guess, for this podcast. But what Repurpose does is it picks up every single podcast that goes out to our syndicated iTunes feed, and then it repurposes them over to YouTube, like automatically.
Sure.
And you can either repurpose the whole YouTube podcast, or you can just repurpose like a 60-minute snippet of it. And I think, even if you set up a different podcast feed, you could probably repurpose it over to that. But, so repurpose.io is a great tool.
Yeah, it sure is.
Some people will notice that we also do some video of our podcast. So we're recording the video of this whole thing. So beware, you're about to see your mug on social media in the next couple of weeks for sure. If you were trying to get a podcast off the ground, or let's just say some of these guys watching, have tried podcasting but haven't been terribly successful with it, what are some strategies you would use to actually get more people listening in?
Yeah, well, I think strategy is the right word. You can't just publish it and expect that people are going to listen. There has to be some effective strategy behind it. And one of the most effective things that I've seen people do is what I refer to as calling in favors. You reach out to the people who you know are in your corner, who are supportive of you, and would love to help you promote this new project that you're working on. And you ask them very specifically. You don't just leave it in their lap, generally speaking. You ask them very specifically, would you promote this on launch day to your email list? Or would you promote this on your social media feed? And then you give them everything they need to accomplish that. So you're going to give them some artwork. You're going to give them a description. You're going to give them links to your podcast subscription page. I mean, everything. You make it so easy for them. And calling in favors like that gets you immediately out into that person's orbit and enables them to support you. You get in front of their audience as a favor. And it's one of the biggest and most effective ways to jumpstart a podcast.
We use the law of reciprocity and send people T-shirts.
Yeah.
I'm not wearing mine today. The old Peace, Love and Real Estate T-shirt.
Yeah.
So we can see your little setup there, which is very cool. Like you've obviously got some soundproofing around you, and I've got some soundproofing around me. If you wanted to record something, I mean, you've seen some disasters from us where I've been at events and just and stuck, a microphone in my phone and spoken to someone with trolleys clanging past and all sorts of things. I think that was the Will Ainsworth podcast. We sort of tried to record that so many times. But what is the minimum that you need?
I think the minimum you need is an external microphone for your computer. You need a quiet room. It doesn't have to be a perfect studio. It just needs to be quiet without, a lot of echo. And honestly, the best studio I've ever recorded in was in a walk-in closet with all the clothes hanging in there. It just absorbed the sound so well, and it was such a great sounding room. So it doesn't have to be super fancy. You've just got to have a decent external mic, which can cost you less than $100, software on your computer to record with, and then a quiet room, and you're good to go. And in that quiet room, don't neglect the floor. I mean, if it's a hard floor, you need some kind of covering on that because it's just going to echo all around if you don't.
Yeah, we actually have an old Persian carpet on this floor. You can't see it at the moment, but just for the guys at home that are playing along, people look at this and go, "Wow, that's a big carpet." But it does tend to, does tend to absorb some of the jackhammering in North Sydney that's been going on for the past 3 years. So, are there any other resources or anything like that you would recommend for these guys to look into if they were thinking about starting a podcast, or are there any other realtors that you can think of who started a podcast that they should check out?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there are a lot of podcasters in the United States who are real estate agents or real estate investors who have started podcasts. There's so many, I can't even name them all. In particular, there's one called Bigger Pockets that's about real estate investing, buying homes to fix and flip and those kinds of things. Those guys do a great job, and they've actually scaled up as they've gone and have their own professional studio and all that kind of stuff now. But they started out very humble beginnings, just two friends who wanted to start talking about real estate investing. And it just went gangbusters because it was such an interesting topic that so many people really saw an opportunity in to actually apply what they were learning. As far as resources go, I have a course called How to Podcast Step by Step, which is, imagine this, how to podcast step by step. And it's free to anybody that is in your audience and wants a copy of it. So if you just give them my contact information and they tell me they heard about me on Elite Agent, I'd be happy to send them a link to that course, and they can just walk through it. It's a DIY kind of a thing that gives downloadable action sheets that they can fill in the blanks and make sure they've checked all the boxes and then just move on to the next video. And by the end of 12 videos, they will have a podcast launched and on iTunes ready to go.
Yeah, so just step by step follow the bouncing ball.
Exactly.
So we know the value of a good editor in a podcast, and we have, we've had some hits and misses until we found you. So what should a good editor really do for you? And tell us, I know the answer to this question, but why should you not edit your own podcast?
Let's start with that last question first. You should not edit your own podcast because you have more valuable things to invest your time in. You could be out there, making sales, meeting new clients, working your CRM to follow up on good relationships. I mean, all those sorts of things are a much better use of your time. Editing your podcast is something that unless you're a natural and you already know how to do it in terms of the software, it's going to be a huge time suck to learn and to master. And you really need to master it in order for it not to be a time suck, because you can always run into things that are issues. Now, what a good podcast editor will do for you is they will manage all of the things on the back end of the recording that need to be managed. So that's taking out background noise. It's optimizing levels between speakers so that nobody's in their car turning up the volume to hear one and then turning it down because the other one's too loud, which sadly still happens a lot on podcasts. They will also be able to help make the audio more enjoyable and more intelligible. That's how I view it, because you'll have guests on who are brilliant at what they do, but they can't talk themselves out of a paper bag. And so you need a good editor who understands language, who understands how a sentence is structured, and can listen and hear what the person's trying to say. And by the time they're done editing, it says what they were trying to say, rather than hearing all the fumbles and warbles and stutters and filler words and all those things. It's not always necessary to cut out all of that stuff, but what I find is the more you do, the more fun it is to listen to that show.
Yeah, absolutely. So the number of, likes that you cut out of mine, have you kept count yet? No,
I haven't. Sometimes I will take everything I cut out of an episode and put it in a different track and then put music underneath it. And it's so funny. It's so funny.
I do not want to hear that.
Yeah, you actually might get a kick out of it. I'll send you someone else's. How's that? Not yours.
I think that sounds much better. So, Carey, it's been wonderful talking to you one-on-one these days. Thank you so much for coming on to our show.
Absolutely.
If there was one thing that you would like people to remember as a result of listening to this, or one thing that you would like people to do, what would it be?
I think what I would encourage people to do is to not let the microphone get in the way of your voice. And what I mean by that is some people get intimidated when a microphone's stuck in their face and they feel awkward. And let me just say this, you will feel awkward at first, but the more you do it, the more natural it becomes, just like riding a bike. And if you imagine a specific person that you're speaking to who you know needs to know about the topic that you're addressing, and just speak directly to them, you'll find that the content comes out a lot better, and it actually becomes something you enjoy over time because you realize you're actually helping people with something that you've been blessed to understand yourself. So I would say just get that mic in your face and start talking, start learning. And, most podcasters throw away the first episode anyway, so don't sweat it. Just get out there and do it.
Well, Joe Rogan's first episode was a tragedy, and so was mine. But, when you get up to episode 150 something where we are now, consistency wins. You get way more comfortable with it.
Oh, yeah. I think one of the sayings that I love the most is that every master was a failure at first. And that's entirely true with podcasting.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I would say is get yourself a good editor.
Well, I think I would agree with you on that.
Carey Green, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sam.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Elevate from Elite Agent. To download your written action guide from this podcast containing extra tips, links and shortcuts, visit eliteagentelevate.com.